Hello, class. My name is Day Martin Jr., and this presentation is called Roots of Resilience: How Pre-Colonial African Culture and Initiatives Shaped the Foundations of African American Business Tradition. So, first, I want to tell you guys a little bit more about myself. Again, my name is Day Martin Jr., but most of my friends call me TJ. I'm a sophomore business administration student from Wilmington, Delaware. The first topic in Chapter 1 is about pre-colonial African markets. Since there was a surplus of production in pre-colonial Africa, markets were very viable. In 1688, the streets of countries like Benin were full of kine, cotton, elephant teeth, and European ware markets. Men were usually merchants and traders, while women were brokers in a market economy, but could be merchants and traders in larger markets. Entertainment was huge in market life. Bands of musicians playing the drums and gongs were all over the place in this situation. So these markets would end up getting their items through long distance trade operations with those outside their region or nation. These trades broke down into two levels. One, long distance trade carried out by merchants from strange nations, such as the Hausa, Mande, Mossi, and Akani. Two, long distance trade from middleman nations, which controlled trade that moved through their territory from inland regions to the coast. Conflict would often occur when stranger nations would pass through middleman nations, and the details in these African markets show the complexity of the political economies in these African societies. Trading organizations were huge in pre colonial Africa. These trading organizations comprised of traders and professional merchants. The two tribes I want to talk about are the Akani tribe and the Asante tribe. The Akani tribe secured a near monopoly of internal commodity exchanges on the Gold Coast. They controlled gold exports and international gold trade. On the other hand, the Asante tribe exported slaves first, then specialized in trading guns. The Akani tribe was the most cooperative merchant association in pre-colonial Africa, while the Asante represented the most militaristic trade operations. Traders and merchants were essential to the economic life of pre-colonial West and West Central Africans, facilitating commodity exchanges of surplus goods. Craft and merchant guilds were organized groups that played crucial roles in economic, social, and political life of the region. The guilds were established to manage the production of goods and maintain standards within their respective crafts and commercial activities. Artisans specialized in producing metalware, jewelry, weapons, pottery for cooking and carrying water, and many other important items. Iron, on the other hand, was a necessity throughout the West and West Central Africa. It was used to make hoes, knives, spears, and other ornaments. Guild membership was usually determined by household and kinship groups because skills were passed down by generation. Craft production met household needs, satisfied local market demands, and allowed for trade in long distance markets to secure items not produced locally. African work ethics have always been top notch as a group. The economic successes and work ethic of individuals then were tied to their kinship group. This determined one's social and political standing. Differences in wealth and prestige emerged as heads of households and lineages strove to become first among equals. One example of a job was the cultivation of tropical crops like rice. This was much needed. This was a much needed job because there was a surplus of these crops. There was a variety of cultivation methods for different situations. There was shifting cultivation, permanent cultivation, tree cultivation, and much more. These people also worked so hard because they saw each other as one family and made it a point to have each other's back. They created mutual aid societies and saving organizations to help each other out. They also participated in communal activities such as roofing a house and building compounds. Other examples of industries that were big money makers at the time included the textile industry, cotton and indigo production, livestock with goats, sheep, and cattle, mining, gold, iron, salt, and copper, and fishing. Women had important roles in production and trade. They participated in the economy at four levels: agricultural production, cottage industry, craft manufacturing, market commodity trading, and common labor. Most African women were involved in domestic production and trade at the local levels. Food production, processing, and preparation were the most important economic activities for pre colonial African women. They also produced and sold shea butter, palm oil, cool nuts, flour ground from maize and millet, and more. Women's economic activities were usually determined by age. Younger women did more strenuous gender based activities, while older women were involved in the preparation of medicinal herbs. Taxes and fees were based off the value of goods transported. Cowrie shells were used as a monetary system due to it being durable and non counterfeitable in West Africa. Iron was also a common medium used in exchanges for slaves, gold, ivory, textiles, and foodstuffs. Just like us Americans now, pre colonial Africans did not want to pay taxes, so they would find ways to hide their wealth. They would make it seem like they were poorer than they really were to escape the rapacious hands of their superiors. Although displays of wealth were important, pre colonial African merchants and traders were quite circumspect in their business affairs, especially when it came to concealing the extent of their financial success. In the transatlantic slave trading period, Europeans and Americans were cognizant and respectful of the African commercial system and expertise. The business ethic that was deeply entrenched in the economic life of pre colonial African states can be seen in the cultural beliefs and worldview of wealth and poverty that distinguishes the traditions and folklore of these societies. To the Asante people, being wealthy is uber important. They had their own Asante aphorisms on trade, wealth, and poverty, and number 12 says, poverty is stupidity, and 13 says, poverty is madness. One huge myth is that Africans were stolen and traded to America, which is simply not true. Africans were not stolen. They were traded by higher up Africans to the Europeans. Europeans were not allowed to come into Africa freely. Africans traded slaves for war power and guns. From the 16th to the 19th century, powerful African states had the capacity not only to wage war against each other, but to defend themselves versus European military intrusions. This stolen people myth obscures the realities of the complex political economies that existed in pre colonial Africa. There was a slave trade marketing system in place in West Africa before Europeans even came in contact. The transatlantic slave trade began in 1444 with the shipment of 235 Africans taken directly from the Guinea coast to Portugal, where they were sold. In 1501, Africans were taken as slaves to the Americas for the first time. It was not until the 17th century that the Atlantic slave trade was established on a massive and systematic basis. Patrick S. Manning, one of the longest serving members of the House of Representatives ever, estimated that from 1700 to 1850, a possible 21 million Africans were victims of the Atlantic slave trade, both in Africa and the New World. 5 million died within 1 year of capture. 9 million became slaves in the New World. Europe and white America profited, but African human capital costs were tremendous in the loss of productivity and labor in Africa. The first Africans at Jamestown were company men and women just like whites. In the 1620s, the first Africans in New York were contraband seized from either the Spanish or Portuguese warship, then were made into company employees. They also worked cultivating land, being street cleaners, ditch diggers, cartmen, and jobs with craft skills. Africans contributed to the initial building of New York's infrastructure. West and West Central Africans had occupational diversity and agricultural expertise along with a work ethic. This is what made them invaluable as slaves. Africans from the Gold Coast were preferred by New England and South Carolina. They were in demand because of their reputation for vigor and intelligence. Strong preference for Senegamians among planters in the American slave markets because they were seen as having a strong equestrian and cattle raising tradition. With the initial open grazing of cattle by Africans in the 17th century, South Carolina and Louisiana, African Americans became the nation's first American cowboys. The Senegambians' expertise in rice tillage made them desirable slaves because rice became a big business in international markets. Colonial African American slave provision grounds were plots of land allocated to enslaved people in the American colonies, particularly in the 18th and early 19th century. These grounds were intended to allow enslaved individuals to grow their own food and produce supplementary crops alongside their primary labor for their owners and for surplus production. Slaves could earn more money by selling surplus commodities from provision ground cultivation. Even if they made money, most slaves did not earn enough to prevent them from existing at near starvation levels due to their owners' treatment. Generally, African slaves marketed many items in colonial America. Provision ground commodities, poultry, farm animals, processed food, and herb based medicinal products are a few of many. Slaves rather market their own products, thus maximizing their profits. They would do this by marketing to adjacent plantations, small farms, and nearby towns. This would also help them escape the monotony of being a slave on a plantation. Despite their limited freedom, African slaves as traders producing for markets established themselves in the business community of colonial America. Property accumulated by slaves was primarily from the trade and marketing of their provision ground surplus production. Slaves were protected under the form of action known as proshinami, whereby masters who arbitrarily seized the slave's property could be sued by a legal proxy for the slave. In their duties as plantation managers, slaves developed both entrepreneurial and entrepreneurial profit making activities, which further increased their access to property. All in all, African Americans retained their commercial culture and propensity to trade. Africans in the Americas quickly found out that their survival would depend on their own initiative. The provision ground system and the trade and marketing activities developed by African slaves in America point to the resilience of African based independent economic activities. The 3 weeks or 3 months it took to transport Africans to the American colonies in the 18th century did not obliterate their memory of these activities. The provision ground system developed by plantation slaves provided an alternative structure for survival for those who refused to be degraded and dehumanized by their involuntary servitude and subordinate status. Present day African American entrepreneurs have developed their base from our history dating back to the 16th century, West and West Central Africans.